Hello and welcome to my channel. Today's video is about Neo Darwinism versus intelligent design, a debate that's been going on in philosophy, science, and religious circles for many decades and many years. And throughout my science career, and even before I got into science, I had many people, both religious people and atheists, tell me things like atheists would tell me things like, wow, I'm surprised you believe in God because I thought you were smart. Or, wow, do you know you sound like someone who believes in intelligent design? Do you know? So you really believe that? And I had people from the religious side tell me that since I believed in science, that I didn't really believe in God, that the true believers don't accept some of the things in science like evolution. However, I think science and spirituality and religion both go together and are very complementary, and they should go together. So this video is going to be about that. I'm pretty much on the intelligent design side, but also why it's important to understand how everything fits together. And religion and spirituality and even atheism is all part of humanity, and it is a belief at the end of the day. However, you can't really prove it. So we're going to talk about the things we do know and how that can help us both spiritually and in our life through a health standpoint and everything else. So I also have a quote from a famous philosopher from when the modern age just begun. His name was Francis Bacon, and he said, "A little knowledge leads men away from Christianity, but a great deal brings them back to it." And I think that's true because Neo Darwinism would like to tell you that random mutations is responsible for the evolution of life. So it was all just random changes in the genome. And whenever that happened, since randomness was the underlying factor in life, there's no need for God. That's what atheists would tell you. However, intelligent design, people who believed in intelligent design, which is many Christians, would say that since there's physical constraints that make life possible, like the structure of water and the structure of biological molecules, then that design had to come from somewhere. So I think that this really echoes Francis Bacon's quote, because to really understand everything, you can't narrow it down to what's going on at one little change in the genome. You have to look at how the whole system. And what we're currently finding in biology is that the structure of water is actually a framework so that whenever you have changes in the system, it can reorganize and adapt to those changes so that you may end up with a system that functions better, or the changes are just a neutral change that doesn't affect the function of the system. So it actually is a quite intelligent design of water that enables life to make little changes so that it can still perpetuate through time and evolve and get better. So let's get into how that happens and the difference between science and religion and what we can take from each. So science seeks to understand the mechanisms of the universe by observation. We form hypotheses, we experiment, get evidence, and then we get theories. So science uncovers how things work by logic, mathematics, empirical experiments, the testability of hypothesis and how falsifiable those hypotheses are. So the how is universal. Gravity, evolution, chemistry, physics, they are the same for all. That's science. That's science as a way of thinking. What can it do? But religion as a way of thinking asks a different question. It asks why. Why are things like the way they are? We all seek to understand the meaning, purpose, and origin of existence. So why are things here? What's the purpose? Atheists would say the why is answered by randomness and natural processes. The universe just is. We find meaning within it. Spirituality, so spiritual people who aren't really religious but aren't atheists either, say the why is answered by a greater intelligence of higher power. The universe is inherently meaningful. And the religious belief is the why is answered by God. The universe has a creator and a purpose, and that purpose is God. So I just want to highlight and mention that this is a spectrum. Atheism to spirituality to religious beliefs is just a spectrum of humanity asking the same question. So it's all the same search. So it's all diverse paths, same question, different answers, but a shared curiosity and wonder. Whether you're an atheist, a spiritual person, or a religious person, you're asking the same question, which is why. But what we can all definitely agree on is the how things work. And I think what mainly happens is depending on what part of the how things work you know based off your past experience, it's going to lead you to fall on a different place on this spectrum. So science and spirituality and religion, asking questions like how and asking questions like why, they are complementary questions. They're not competing. You see too many debates with spiritual or religious people debating atheists, and they never get anywhere. They're pointless. So instead, we should have debates on how they can work together and optimize each other, because there's actually beauty in complementarity. Science tells us how the universe works, our beliefs shape how we live within it. So the how, again, is universal, and the why is personal to each of us, but both can lead to truths in different ways. So now I just wanted to put this slide in showing that Neo Darwinism is still haunting evolutionary theory and kind of still holding back modern perspectives. And even though this has been going on since 1982, it is still happening, and things on this still have to be published in the 2020s. And I also wanted to put two quotes from Genesis. And I'm not trying to say that in scripture, in any type of religious scripture, that you can find predictions of science, but you can see that in their own way, people back then who wrote, the people associated with the Old Testament, were still looking at things in a scientific way and asking not only the why questions, but the how questions. So they knew, for instance, the importance of water, how animals change, adapt, and evolve. They understood these things. And that's why you can find things in the Old Testament, like Genesis 1 2, that says, the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And now we're understanding that the structure of water plays a vital role in life. And not only the fact that we just need it for chemical reactions and you have to drink water every day, but also down to the structure of life. It's basically the scaffolding that life can evolve, adapt, and adjust based off the environment. And then later on in Genesis 1:24, it says, "Let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds." So that is also suggesting that God didn't just magically do it. He told the earth to do it. So the earth did it through geological and chemical and biological processes. And you would think that any intelligent design would be like this so that we can learn more, so that we could help each other. So now let's get into the science of how this all works. And I would like to mention that where I got the ideas from those two quotes was by this book called The Lost World of Genesis 1, and that was given to me by my friend Scott Caldwell, and he showed me these things. Even though me and Scott might differ on some details, in general, we agree that science and religion should be accepted in culture and that they are complementary. They're not working against each other. So let's get into the science a little deeper. I wrote this paper with my former boss, and it was published just a few months ago on February 2026, and it's titled Liquid-Liquid Phase Separation as a Driver of Abiogenesis, that's the origin of life, and evolution. And I showed that it's water, even though this is water and oil, I dyed it blue, all blue for a reason, because this is just an example of how that structure forms. What this paper was about was how water can naturally do this, and biological molecules can group together using this aggregation, this self-aggregation ability of water. So it can separate itself in different compartments, just like oil can separate itself in different compartments in water. Biological molecules can also do that in water through a process called liquid-liquid phase separation. And whenever those biological molecules do that, they do it by a certain mathematical formula, a sigmoidal curve, where they're starting to come together and they're starting to liquid-liquid phase separate. And once they pass a critical threshold or or a concentration, then they condense into these droplets and they can form networks. So it kind of acts like an on and off switch, and this can be used to group together many different proteins in the cell signaling pathway so that you can control not just, one or two proteins, but many different proteins can combine together and act as on and off switches. So it makes cell signaling a lot more complex than just simple phosphorylation. So phosphorylation on proteins can also act as an on and off switch, but even the aggregation of many different proteins can act like an on and off switch through liquid-liquid phase separation. And it's interesting because the two different structures, macromolecular structures of water, have only just been shown in a paper called Evidence for the Generic Existence of Two Structures in Liquid Water. However, a lot of scientists, including me, have been on this and looking at liquid-liquid phase separation in water even before this paper came out. Because as you can see, this paper came out in June and I published this in February. So we got to this, the scientists who have been looking at this understood this from the perspective of intrinsically disordered proteins. However, whenever you look at water, you understand that even liquid water is constantly fluctuating between disordered and high density water and structured, less dense water. Because since it has more space in between the water molecules, it's less dense. And what allows water to combine to form these polyhedral shapes is the bent structure of water, two hydrogen, H2O, and one oxygen. And oxygen has these pi electrons here. Those pi electrons create a negative charge and push the positive hydrogen down so that it kind of has this bent structure at degrees. And since water has this bent structure, it allows it to build polyhedral shapes that you can see right here in 2 dimensions, but also it can form more complex three-dimensional polyhedral shapes like you can see this dodecahedron shape here. And again, liquid water is constantly shifting between these two structured and disordered forms of water. So that's just liquid water, but also it can form gas and it can form solid ice, which the solid ice would be even more structured than this, and then the gas state of water is even more disordered than the liquid portion. But even in the liquid portion, you have a fluctuation between these two structures, and that's what biology, through intrinsically disordered proteins and nucleotides, can take advantage of and stabilize so that they can organize. So you have biology constantly stabilizing and modulating the structure of water, while the structure of water also organizes the biological systems. So that's very interesting, and that's new science that is just beginning to be understood because the papers have just came out confirming these structures of liquid water, and we've just started to understand how biology can interact with these phases of water in the past decade or so. So to continue on, how does this play a role in an intelligent design framework? Because one of the leading biological theories for intelligent design has been symbiosis or endosymbiosis, that it's not just about random mutations that end up producing life. You can have random mutations for an infinite amount of time almost, and you would never, for at least trillions of years, and you would never end up with something as complex as an animal cell that can live with a green algae and a purple bacterium like you can see in this picture. So there's all kind of examples of symbiotic relationships that could never happen through random chance. So there must be some mechanism that rearranges and integrates those random mutations so that everything can work together in homeostasis. So it's interesting because we can observe that happening today in this picture, and you can look at this paper about a microbial eukaryote. That's an animal with a unique combination of purple bacteria. You can see them in purple right here. These little purple things are all bacteria, and green algae as endosymbionts. So all these green things are the green algae. So you have three different organisms living together in a symbiotic relationship. And this organism in particular, we can see that depending on the environment it's in, it'll constantly either have the purple bacteria and green algae inside of the cell working together with it, or it won't, depending on the environment. So it constantly is changing back and forth. So we know that this can happen, this constant change of back and forth, where organisms are living together inside one another, and then in certain environmental pressures, they're living alone. However, in some instances in evolution, this symbiotic relationship continued to happen through time. And that's where animals come from. So you have mitochondria, chloroplasts, and nitroplasts, which nitroplasts were just discovered. And all of these organisms that live inside other cells, it's predicted that they came to be there because of endosymbiosis. So one of these, so you can think of animal cells existed whenever you had one of these symbiotic relationships that they decided just to stay like that. And we have evidence that this happened because our mitochondria, all humans have mitochondria. It's a vital part. It produces all the ATP through oxidative phosphorylation, not all the ATP, but most of the ATP for our metabolism. And we know that the mitochondria has its own DNA. And it has its own DNA because it used to be an ancient purple bacterium that was living inside of the animal cells. It used to be an archaea cell. So an archaean cell came together with a purple bacterium cell, and they decided to stay together and form complex multicellular organisms through endosymbiosis. However, you had plant cells that did a similar thing to gain chloroplasts, and you had an endosymbiotic relationship evolve for the nitroplasts. And you can see the inside and outside of them. And it's quite peculiar that you can still see the same polyhedral geometry in these nitroplasts, because you can see this polyhedral geometry at many different scales of life and in biology today. So this explains what's called the trinity of life: chloroplasts, mitochondria, and nitroplasts, and how we get organic molecules to form on Earth and probably everywhere in the observable universe. You have chloroplasts, or which are in plants, and they're in charge of the carbon cycle. You have mitochondria in all animals, and that's in charge of the oxygen cycle or respiration. So the plants do photosynthesis, the animals have respiration. And then you have the nitrogen cycle, which is responsible for fixing nitrogen onto organic molecules. So all the organic molecules are carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen, which is everywhere on all these molecules. And this is kind of the cycle on Earth that is taking these atoms and incorporating them into the molecules of life. So again, you have photosynthesis, which captures light and energy to build organic molecules and release oxygen. You have cellular respiration, which breaks down organic molecules to produce energy, releasing CO2 and recycling nutrients. And you have the nitroplasts, which are biological nitrogen fixation, and it converts atmospheric nitrogen into organic nitrogen for life. So through the integrated work of chloroplasts, mitochondria, and nitroplasts, Earth maintains the dynamic balance of carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, enabling energy flow, nutrient recycling, and the continuity of life, the continuity. Sorry. And this cycle this cycle on Earth is all regulated and integrated because these are a lot of different cells coming together and a lot of different chemicals and gases that are all mixing together, but they all can be integrated into the same biological framework on Earth through the structure of water, through liquid-liquid phase separation, making tiny networks even inside the organelles of cells and cells themselves. So you can think of the earth in this way, acting as one organism. And that brings me to the Gaia hypothesis, that earth functions as one self-regulating, intelligent entity through the integration of life, water, energy, and cycles. And again, this brings us back to religious thoughts and spiritual thoughts of intelligent design, and that there are levels of consciousness and intelligence that exist way bigger than us, and we are just a framework within that. So you can think of water via liquid-liquid phase separation. It causes a dynamic scaffold to exist, which can integrate the organic trinity, which we talked about on the previous slide. So you have the chloroplasts, mitochondria, and nitroplasts all cycling the different organic atoms needed to build the different structures of life on Earth today. And all of that exists in a symbiotic relationship to maintain homeostasis. And maybe I shouldn't say all of it exists at a symbiotic relationship. There's definitely competition and predators that aren't living in a symbiotic relationship. But down to a cellular level, at least, the trinity is existing in equilibrium and in homeostasis to maintain life on Earth, even through the worst disasters like asteroid impacts. This dynamic equilibrium of oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen always can adapt and change so that life can persist on Earth. So, by dynamically integrating signals between chloroplasts, mitochondria, and nitroplasts across all life and environments, Earth maintains homeostasis of carbon, oxygen, and nitrogen, enabling the planet to act as one living, intelligent system. And this is known as the Gaia hypothesis. And as long as you're humble, you can understand that in the same way, we have mitochondria that are living within all our cells that have their own DNA and their own life, and they have no clue about the goals that we have and the decisions that we make. We are living in an intelligent framework, and we can't understand what the goals and strategies are for that intelligence that's bigger than us. So why is it important to understand these concepts? Because science shows us the way and religion brings us together. Both are needed to optimize how much we can help each other. And I published a paper in 2022 in a breast cancer journal, and it was about metastatic breast cancer. And you can see a giant metastatic breast cancer right here that has multiple nuclei from fusing together because I disrupted the metabolism in these cells. And whenever the metabolism is disrupted, it adapts by growing its mitochondria even larger and expanding the actin cytoskeleton in these cells. And you can see the mitochondrial DNA as little bitty blue dots inside the actin cytoskeleton of this cell. So it's important, and I also associated this with liquid-liquid phase separation. You can look at that paper. It's called The Role of Galectins in Metastatic Breast Cancer, 2022. So it's important to understand that we make the environment that all of these mitochondria have to live in. So if you make a bad environment for the mitochondria, then they'll work against you and things like cancer can emerge. But if you make a good environment and you live healthy, not only from a nutrition and exercise standpoint, but also from a spiritual standpoint, however you do that, then it can actually help your body maintain its normal function and help you maintain your normal function and be a happy person in society. So one pushback I thought I might get on this. So as a scientist, I wanted to put this as like, okay, Jesse, you explained this pretty well on Earth, but what about intelligent design in all of existence in the universe? So for that, I'll bring up quantum fluctuations and that quantum-inspired frameworks for computational fluid dynamics have been developed. So quantum fluctuations is what connects everything together and what mediates the dynamics of quantum systems. So that's like light and other quantum particles like bosons and electrons. So all of these quantum particles are within a framework which is the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which says that there's always a fluctuation of quantum particles. And you can see that it kind of has a liquid-like, a fluid-like nature. So whenever you have, and this picture is just showing fluid dynamics, whenever you have like a jet running through here, it creates different geometrical patterns. So again, these fluid dynamics have a polyhedral framework to them, kind of like a dodecahedron framework, but that's just the most simple framework you can think about that. And water molecules not only exist and can exist in this framework, but many different polyhedral geometries so that it can form really complex lattice designs, which can act as a framework for life and everything else we see in the universe. So even from a quantum perspective, you can think that the physical constraints of fluid dynamics can approximate how all of these particles and molecules behave. So just like the constraints of water constantly can reorganize biological systems so that they can evolve and adapt through time, this fluid-like quantum fluctuation framework also, no matter what changes you have in the quantum dynamics or quantum frameworks, it will constantly reorganize so that you can have an evolution of quantum systems through time. And at the end of the day, everything's a quantum system. So I would say that this is very complex from a quantum perspective to a biological perspective, and it's complex in a simple way because it all has to do with the computational power of fluid dynamics, which can be defined by these polyhedral structures that are familiar to us. You can see them almost everywhere. If you go to, I went to a hotel one time and they had a lamp that had this structure, and you can see these structures everywhere through biology and through inorganic forms, and you can see them at all scales, from polyhedral structures on Jupiter to polyhedral structures in cells, which I showed on the previous slide, and they use polyhedral structures to predict quantum fluctuations. So these polyhedral structures are an intelligent design that can organize things, and I think they most definitely answer the how, and at least point and suggest, not prove. You have to have faith to think that there is intelligence that are bigger than us. I don't think there's any way to prove it, but all of these frameworks that can reorganize things, or organize biological molecules and quantum systems, no matter how it happens, points to an intelligent designer, points to a higher power. So the take-home message is that science asks us to remain curious, religion asks us to remain humble. Both ask us to seek truth. Whether you are religious or not, I hope we can agree on one thing: the pursuit of truth is always worthwhile. And if God is truth, then every honest scientific discovery brings us one step closer to understanding the universe and perhaps in its own way understanding God. Understanding intelligent design, I think, does point to a higher power. And if we can understand that intelligent design, we can help each other more and do the right thing, even when it comes down to simple things like getting enough water every day and proper nutrition so we can all be healthy and happy. So I hope you enjoyed this video. God bless, and you have a good one.